and I work for the National Alliance to End Homelessness. I'm going to be just quickly introducing this webinar and then running the Q&A portion of the webinar. So our panelists today are Cynthia Nagendra, the Director of the Center for Capacity Building at the National Alliance to End Homelessness. Cynthia has a lot of experience in Continuum of Care NOFAs and actually has completed some herself. So not only is she going to be really helpful today, she also, I think, feels your pain a little bit in this very stressful time. Our other panelist is King Horne, the Executive Director of Homeward in Richmond, Virginia. And she is going to be giving you an example of how one community is running their ranking and scoring process. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Cynthia to kick off the webinar.
Thank you, Anna. So today we are going to really focus on sort of reviewing and ranking projects and talk about the reallocation process and what that looks like. So there are some other webinars that have happened this week. USICH had a great webinar on the overview of the NOFA, and HUD also had a webcast, and I would highly encourage you to look at those as well, because we're really going to try to focus on review and ranking projects today. I'll do some overview of some of the important points, but really going to try to drill down on how communities can focus on this part. If you've gotten started already on this, that's great. We could poll to find out who has already started, who still kind of needs to figure out how to start this process. And it was about 50-50, and I think we're going to try to cover kind of what you can do if you haven't already started and what it looks like if you already have. So we're going to focus on HUD's policy priorities first, and mainly we're going to talk about the policy priority of strategic allocation of resources. We will talk about ranking projects, both what the NOFA requires and some of the processes that you can employ that might make you much more competitive. We'll just spend a minute talking about what the tiering process looks like. As I said, there's a lot of information out there that you should consult if you want to know more about that. We will talk about what reallocation is, why you should reallocate, and what projects you can reallocate to. We'll also talk about how do you decide where to reallocate, what kind of scoring criteria you should look at, and a process for project review and rank. And we're really lucky to have King Horne as the Executive Director of Homeward, because Homeward is the planning and coordinating organization for the homeless services in the greater Richmond region. They have a really robust process, and she's going to really kind of walk you through what this process looks like on the ground, who needs to be involved, how to make these decisions, how to get buy-in from your providers. We know that this is a very difficult process, and it has to happen very quickly. So Kelly is going to really help us kind of think through what that looks like. So there's some very important things to know about this NOFA. There's a lot of important things to know, but 3 takeaways that we have, and we just want to make sure that everyone really gets, if they only listen to the first couple of minutes of this webinar, that this is the most competitive NOFA we have ever seen. And as Anna said, as someone who's written NOFAs, I understand your pain, and I've gone through this review and ranking process with COCs, and I was both kind of excited by all the new things in this NOFA. You know, it kind of makes things much more solidified, kind of gives back up to a lot of COC leadership to make the kinds of changes that they have wanted to make for a long time. But it's also a little daunting. There's a lot to do, there's a lot that's different, and there's a lot to really think through, and you really need to kind of figure out how to be strategic. And this is really just not something the COC lead agency can do by themselves, or just work with the HMIS lead, and just kind of request information from projects. This is something that really requires COC-wide dialogue and conversation. So that kind of makes it, everybody's project. In the past, I know sometimes COC lead organizations have kind of been on their own with this, but this is really a COC-wide process. So because it's the most competitive NOFA ever, HUD is using this NOFA to implement a strong preference for performance and effective practices. And these are really coming from the HEARTH Act. These are performance measures that were in the HEARTH Act that was passed in 2009. We had regulations passed in 2012, and we had some kind of guidance around how to do performance measures last year. So now we really kind of see how they're going to be used and how we're going to be scored on them. So really, depending on the strength of the community's continuum of care and their individual projects, a high-performing community could increase its capacity by almost 15%, up to 15%, through the addition of new projects. So if you're scoring really well, if your CoC application does well, and your projects do well, you could add 15%. A low-performing community that might not have made some of the transitions that are in Hearth and that have been recommended over the last few years could lose as much as 15% in these projects. So I'm not trying to scare you, just trying to really get folks to understand that this is very different this year. So it's unlikely that communities are going to reach either of those extremes, but the preference just shows that communities can do the most for the populations of people in need. The ones that do that will receive the most funding. So the next important thing to know is that performance on the goals to end homelessness is scored. So performance on the opening door timeframes and the Hearth Act performance criteria to end homelessness are really important. The NOFA is awarding 15 points each for the strength of a community strategy in ending homelessness for chronically homeless people, veterans, youth, and families with children. So these are the 4 populations named in opening doors. These are the goals we are working towards. We're asked to end veteran homelessness by the end of 2015. So this is a very important year for that. You will have to answer a lot of questions about that. The Alliance is putting out a series of blogs on each of these populations and kind of what to pay attention to when you are looking at your NOFA. The third thing to really take away is reallocation is important, and I can't stress this enough, and that's because HUD can't seem to stress this enough either. That's kind of why we're doing this whole webinar on just reallocation, basically, because the competition will reward communities that have carefully evaluated their existing programs and really allocated funding according to the need and performance of their community. Communities that favor allocating funding to program models that have been proven, that achieve progress, that are really meeting their outcomes, that are aligned with community goals, those CoCs will be much more competitive in the NOFA competition. So that's why this process is just incredibly important this year. And it's almost impossible to avoid. So in many ways, the NOFA is really one of the clearest public policy documents that HUD releases. It delineates the federal priorities and goals about how HUD really wants local communities to use this federal funding. And it shows you what outcomes they expect to see from those investments. And so again, this year, like last year, HUD's first policy priority is strategic resource allocation. And this means that CoCs should seriously reconsider reallocating funds, as I said before, and decide how to kind of best use these resources and use them in that required ranking and tiering process. So this is straight from this year's NOFA, and I think, again, just sort of outlining the same theme or kind of beating that same drum. Using performance and outcome data, CoCs should decide how to strategically use all federal and local resources available to end homelessness within their communities and allocate resources to effective interventions that reduce homelessness. So the thing is, there probably are some very good programs that have been funded for a long time in your community, but you're starting to see through your data that either these programs are a little bit more expensive than some of the other programs in your community, but are achieving the same outcomes. And maybe there's programs that you have identified that are better meeting the need of some of your more vulnerable populations in a more cost-effective way. So maybe this is a time and a good incentive for a provider to change their program model, which you can kind of incentivize through this process, right? So this is really not always about, who's a good program, who's a bad program, but who is really meeting the needs of our community. How can we use what are scarce resources in the most effective way to really reduce homelessness in our community? So, as in the past couple of years, you are required to rank projects. CoCs are going to be required to rank all of your projects submitted by project applicants, and this does not include CoC or planning projects or UFA costs. So this year you don't have to worry about your CoC or planning project or UFA costs, and that's something that is just completely separate from the ranking project, from the ranking list. Excuse me. The list of ranked projects has to include all the renewal projects, any new projects you've created through reallocation, as well as any permanent permanent housing bonus projects that you will be applying for. And we'll talk a little bit more about how that works in a minute. CoC should really consider the policy priorities established in the NOFA when they're thinking about how to determine the ranking. So really look at those policy priorities. HUD would like to see you rank your projects by using those policy priorities. We know that those are the policy priorities that HUD has and that most CoCs really should adopt, as we know that they are the best ways to really reduce and end homelessness in your CoC. And of course, projects have to pass HUD's eligibility and threshold requirements. So it doesn't matter where they're on your list. If a project comes in with a project application that does not match HUD's eligibility and threshold requirements, it will not be funded. And this happened to quite a few projects last year that were surprised, because even if they were in Tier 1, they weren't funded. But they have to really pass those threshold requirements. So really try to educate your project applicants in what those are. And when you're reviewing those project applications, make sure that they're meeting these requirements. To sort of get these points, you must have a comprehensive project review process. So it's kind of not enough to just say that you're having a process. You actually have to show what the process is. You get 10 points for attaching objective criteria. So hopefully this webinar will kind of help you establish that objective criteria if you don't already have it, but you sort of need to show we have an objective review and rank process. This is how we comprehensively review projects. This is what we look at. And we're kind of looking at performance. We're not just looking at some things that we have probably looked at in the past in their APRs. We're looking at their performance. So 3 points is for considering past performance data from APRs or HMIS. So where are you getting your data from? Hopefully it's from both, and that you are collecting this information from your projects ahead of time in your local application, and asking them for the things you need to be able to score them. You get 3 points for considering the severity of needs experienced by program participants. And this is because we really want to incentivize communities to prioritize the populations that have the most severe needs. So we want to make sure that projects that are serving very vulnerable populations are incentivized to be ranked in a high way, and so you get points for that. You also get 3 points for the public announcement of the ranked list. The CoC's priority listing must be posted online. So to get full points, you want to make sure that you do that, and there are dates attached to that in the NOFA, so you want to read the NOFA carefully. In the NOFA, the CoCs are actually asked to report how they conducted a performance-based ranking process, as I said before. So there are some actual questions and kind of boxes that you check in your application to show what you use to review projects. Some of the questions are here. Did your CoC review APRs for every renewal project? Are you looking at your APRs when you're actually looking at each project and the data that comes from those APRs? So a lot of the performance data is going to come right out of those APRs. I'm sure many of you know that this is something that projects should be, trying to make sure their data is right. Oftentimes they don't think it is because of something that might be in there, but you can always remind them that that they're the ones who filled it out, and you're just using what they gave you to come up with these scores. So which factors were you using? Did you review their performance, length of stay, percent of permanent housing exit destination, how much income was increased for the participants in their program over the course of that program? Are you looking at things like participant eligibility, how much their program capacity is utilized? Their drawdown rates, are they drawing down regularly? Are they making sure that they're drawing down all the funds that they can draw down? And did they have any funds recaptured by HUD? That's a question that you can ask. It's a question you can get, CoC lead agencies can get that information from the field office. So that's an important thing to know. Why were funds recaptured? What did the project do to change that, or were there any findings that they needed to work on? Also, how are you looking at the need for specialized population services such as youth, survivors of domestic violence, families with children, chronically homeless people, and veterans? Also, the NOFA strongly suggests that you review your transitional housing projects for cost effectiveness and performance. So you probably have some transitional housing projects that are performing really well. you want to look at things like how cost-effective they are against each other and against other program types and see what their rate of permanent housing exit is. Really quickly, and as I said before, this is covered really well in USICH's webcast as well as HUD's webcast, and I highly encourage you to read the NOFA when you're figuring this part out. But the process of tiering is back again this year. You do have to put things in two tiers, Tier 1 and Tier 2. The amount of funding that's available for Tier 1 is 85% of the CoC's annual renewal demand. And HUD will conditionally award projects from the higher scoring CoCs to low scoring CoCs in that order. Tier 2 is the amount of funding available for Tier 2, which is the difference between Tier 1 and the CoC's annual renewal demand. Plus, you can add that available amount for the permanent housing bonus. Okay, so your Tier 2 basically is you take your annual renewal demand, you subtract your Tier 1, and then you can add that 15% of your FPRN for the permanent housing bonus. And the funding will be determined by the point value of each project this year on a 100-point scale. That's a very different way than they've done it before. Tier 2 is a 100-point scale, and all Tier 2 projects will be funded in point order, starting with the highest scoring projects, meaning all the projects that score the full 100 points will get scored first, and then all the way down until they run out of money. So Tier 2 kind of breaks down like this. There's 60 points of the CoC score. So whatever you get on your CoC application is directly tied to these project applications. The project applicants know now that how the whole CoC does in fact affect their project application. So it kind of ties their performance and the CoC-wide performance together. You get 20 points for the ranking of the project applications, and there's kind of a whole scale of how that works. You get 10 points for the renewal and for having renewal and new permanent housing, renewal safe haven, HMIS, SSO projects for coordinated entry, or transitional housing that exclusively serves homeless youth. So you'll get 10 points for any of those project types. 3 points for renewal of transitional housing, and 1 point for renewal supportive services only projects. And then 10 points go to show for projects that are committing to housing first. So you want to make sure that the project is committing to housing first. Is it low barrier? If it's not low barrier, it's kind of hard. That project will lose all of those 10 points. Okay, so things like, if it prioritizes rapid placement, stabilization, and housing, if it has any service participation requirements or preconditions to entry, like sobriety or minimum income, it is not housing first. So those programs will not get those 10 points. It's a good time to try to get them to change their policies. So reallocation. Reallocation is, as I said before, incredibly important. They've done basically everything they can do to get you to reallocate. And with the tiering process, it's really the smartest way for you to fund the most effective projects and kind of make the best progress towards your goals, not just this year, but in years that will be coming up. And I know that it's a very politically fraught process. It can be very challenging, especially if it hasn't started already. And the best thing you can do is really communicate these scoring expectations to stakeholders as early as possible. You can blame HUD, and it can be far less painful and time-consuming if you started early. If you haven't, that's okay. You can still kind of start the process right away. And you can also remember that folks can reallocate voluntarily. So projects can reallocate voluntarily if they feel like their project isn't aligning with the overall CoC's priorities, they want to find other funding, they can reallocate voluntarily. So reallocation, really quickly, is the CoC's process to shift and adapt funds from existing CoC-funded renewal projects to create one or more new projects. So a reallocated project becomes a new project. You have a new project application. And through reallocation, CoCs can create new evidence-informed projects, hopefully, by eliminating projects that are underperforming or maybe are more appropriately funded from other sources, or ones that decide to give up their funding. And this is done through the annual CoC program competition. So this can only happen during the competition. Reallocation is really when you want to change to a totally different project component type. Component changes such as if you have a transitional housing project, and you wanted to change to permanent supportive housing, or if a transitional housing project wants to reduce the average length of time households are in programs. Reallocation is when you want to change to a new project component. So changing from transitional housing to permanent supportive housing, that would be a change. It's also when you want to change population. So major population changes, such as if a project wanted to change from serving families with children to serving individuals experiencing chronic homelessness, would require reallocation. There's some component changes that don't. There's changes that don't necessarily require reallocation. I'll talk about those in a second. So why do you want to reallocate? You want to right-size your system. It really encourages you to make sure that the precious community resources you have are used in the most strategic way possible. And reviewing your project performance and reallocating to better performing projects really achieves that by kind of effectively using those resources in the best possible way you can. It's an important tool to make these strategic improvements. It's one of the best tools you have all year to make these changes. And of course, you're required to rank projects into Tier 1 and Tier 2. So reallocation really seems like the best thing to do in that process. There are types of reallocation you can do. You can take one project and make it, you can take funding from a whole project, one project, and turn that into a new project operated by the same provider. So you can incentivize that in your scoring system. You can tell projects, look, if you decide to reallocate and you really want to, and you're going to start a new project, we can prioritize you for that funding. Funding from one project can become a new project operated by a different provider. Funding from one project can become many new projects. So you can take one big pot and split that up. Funding from many projects can be combined to become one new project. And again, and finally, funding from many projects can become many projects. So there's different ways you can do this. You have some options around this, and you kind of need to sort of see what your pot looks like and who your project applicants are. As it says in the NOFA, you can reallocate from any type of renewal project. So you can take any one of your renewal projects, no matter what type it is, and you can reallocate to new permanent supportive housing that serves chronically homeless individuals and families, new rapid rehousing projects for homeless families and individuals who enter directly from the streets or emergency shelters, youth up to age 24, or are fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence. And that's category 4 of the homeless definition. So that's exciting. You can serve a lot more folks now with rapid rehousing projects. You can take a new supportive services only project for centralized or coordinated assessment system. And I want to say that before you had to take an old SSO project and turn it into a centralized or coordinated assessment system project, but now you can just reallocate from any project and turn it into a coordinated entry project. You can also reallocate to new dedicated HMIS. So as I said before, you can reallocate in different types of ways, and it's important to know that you can reallocate parts of projects. You can look to see if people maybe aren't necessarily spending down all of their funds from year to year, for example. You can ask projects to submit their drawdowns during the local application, or you can review this information with the field office. And you'd be surprised to see how many projects actually don't spend their money from year to year to year. And you'll start to see trends. There are projects that sometimes leave 10 to 25% of their funds on the table every year. So if a project is underspending, that's a no-brainer, right? They don't need that funding. This is a good piece of funding to reallocate. And that's another thing that a project can also voluntarily reallocate. So it's important to also remember that reallocation is not a continuation of an old project serving the same clients with the new program name. So I think HUD probably got a number of applications where this happened. So you don't want to do that. If a project is changing from transitional housing to permanent supportive housing, for example, existing residents of that transitional housing won't be eligible for that new permanent supportive housing. So you don't want to have a project that says, yep, we're going to serve the same clients, and we're going to be permanent supportive housing, it's going to be the same building. That's just not going to work, and that's not going to meet eligibility. So HUD's really going to carefully review those project applications. You, as the CoC leadership and who are making these decisions, want to make sure you are carefully reviewing applications for new projects. Make sure that they're aligning with the new project eligibility criteria. Also, I just wanted to say, when you want to make minor changes to your project, that can often be made through grant amendments. You don't have to do everything through the reallocation process. You might want to talk to your field office if you're not sure where your change falls. Sometimes just changing a budget line item or making some sort of changes in how you do your units or something like that, that can be through a grant amendment. So just check with your field office. How should a CoC make decisions about ranking and reallocating projects? So this is kind of really what I'm going to kind of give you an overview of, and Kelly is going to really dive deeply into. So the first thing you want to do is determine your community's priorities. If this is something that hasn't already happened, it's definitely a little bit challenging to do that while the NOFA competition is over, because it kind of requires meetings and a lot of conversations with the right stakeholders. So if you haven't done this already, you know, it's okay. You can start at the next step, but this is something you should generally ideally consider. You want to ideally consider things that your system really needs. What resources does your system need? How do you want to prioritize? If you have a coordinated entry system, who are you prioritizing for what types of intervention? What's your system-wide spending plan? We have a tool that's a CoC spending plan on our website, and that Kelly is going to walk you through as well. What's in your strategic plan? How does that align with who we want to fund? And what are your overall policy priorities? These are kind of the things that should go into what you're thinking about when you come up with your scoring system. The second step is to develop an objective performance-based review and rank process. So you're going to want to do a few things to really come up with a robust process, and this is probably what will get you full points. And again, Kelly's going to talk to you about what this looks like on the ground, but just a quick overview of the important components, which are have a review and rank committee or group. It's really key to have a group of people, hopefully, that are entirely non-conflicted, which can sometimes be hard in smaller communities. But you want to have a group, and that can be the CoC governance board or a CoC committee, as long as it's an entity that's familiar with how to evaluate and monitor these programs. You want to solicit input from stakeholders, inform CoC-funded projects and potential new applicants so that they know what they're going to be scored on. Have a panel of non-conflicted and knowledgeable folks that are going to review, score, and rank these projects. And then you might have to prepare to engage in an appeals process if that ends up being needed. The third step is to develop a scoring tool for evaluating projects. So you want to develop scoring criteria and related tools that align with your strategic spending priorities, HUD's policy priorities, and those goals we talked about in opening doors. And remember, I showed this slide earlier, you want to try to include what HUD is asking you to include to get points. So performance from APRs, monitoring criteria, and these needs for special population services. Some other things you want to look at, though, in your scoring criteria to sort of help you evaluate projects are the following. And these are to really look at the project performance, and then I'll talk a little bit about how the project kind of interacts with the system. But to look at project performance, you can ask questions like the following. You don't need to ask all of these questions, but this is kind of a menu of options. So if you're looking to put together a scoring tool right now, this is a good list of options to choose from. You might want to start with a few of these and then kind of build your tool over the next couple of years. So does the project prioritize the most vulnerable populations? We know HUD is really incentivizing this, so our communities should as well. Does the project use the Housing First approach? Housing First is all over this application. There's many places that you get points for having a Housing First project. So to continue to fund projects that are not Housing First are going to severely hurt your CoC score, and you're going to lose funding. So you want to make sure that you are, trying to fund projects or help projects become Housing First projects. And that's not just permanent supportive housing. That's transitional housing. That is your rapid rehousing. You want to make sure that all of your projects are low barrier in using that approach. How well is the project performing and achieving outcomes? These are the outcomes that are outlined in the NOFA. Rates of exit, increasing or maintaining income, connecting clients to mainstream benefits is another thing you can look at, and trying to reduce people's average length of stay or average length of homelessness. How do they participate in HMIS? Is it cost effective? We talked a lot about, trying to figure out if a project is cost effective, if it's transitional housing, but you should look at all your projects. And you can measure them against each other. If one project that is permanent supportive housing, is like spending maybe $12,000 per client, and another one is spending $60,000 per client, that might be okay depending on what populations they're serving, but you really want to try to figure out why that is. Has it improved its services? Does it include consumer feedback, past monitoring findings, things like that? And does the project participate in the CoC's coordinated entry system? So you can start looking at how does the project actually interact with our system, and this is a way to incentivize projects to do these things. Does the project participate in CoC meetings or work groups? Is it contributing towards the goals and activities in our NOFA, in opening doors, in our plans? And if it's a new project, so it doesn't have past performance, is it proposing a project that aligns with these needs and fills some kind of gap, right? So we don't want to just it's great that you want that new money, but you want to make sure that project is really aligning with what your overall CoC priorities are. And then you want to review those projects. You're going to use your scoring criteria that the CoC has approved. You want to have a kind of a process for that locally. Figure out whether the project is necessary in this in the whole scheme of things when you see all the projects that have applied. And again, if it's transitional housing, just ask, is it low barrier? Is it serving the most vulnerable populations? We know that the vulnerable populations that are good fits sometimes for transitional housing are youth, people fleeing domestic violence, and people who choose to be in recovery. So we really would like to use transitional housing for those very vulnerable populations. And then rank your projects according to score. Okay, these are some of our resources. We're compiling a number of resources with the Alliance, things like some blog posts, we have a scoring tool, and this webinar, and a number of other things are coming, and they will be here. And we're going to post this webinar, so you'll be able to access that. And now I'm going to turn it over to Kelly. Thank you so much, Kelly, for taking us into Richmond.
All right. Well, we just hosted a big international bike race, so Richmond's the place to be these days. So, while Cynthia gets that loaded, this first slide just gives a little bit of overview of our Continuum of Care, just so you all understand. Our numbers are relatively low, especially compared to some of the larger metro areas. It is down by almost a third since 2009. And I think I just want to preface what I'm going to show you with 2 points. So first, all of the tools we have are on our CoC website, which is at the end of this, but it's endhomelessnessrva.org, right? So we copy, which should tell y'all, feel free to take and modify anything that we have. All of our work is funded with charitable dollars, so if it helps end homelessness, that's good. It helps us have that conversation locally. And then the second piece is that reallocation is really about having a hard conversation in your community. And as Cynthia mentioned, we've had reallocation of the last several years. Some have been CoC initiated. Really, we can't fund that program with these dollars. And then we've had some grantee initiated reallocation. And of course, it's easier to be in the space with the grantee-initiated reallocation, but that really comes by having hard conversations over time and using your data. All right, so we'll just jump in. I'll give you this. The next slide really shows a little bit of what Cynthia just went through in a really good overview. And I really do want to stress that you need to understand your system, understand your data. Y'all will see how we do that. We've built up our information over time. We are far from perfect, and we would like to get even more ahead of the game. I know some communities are really out there and have the year-round, so they know what's coming, and we're working to that point. We have gotten really much better at doing our planning and priority setting, and you'll see the specifics of that in just a second. One thing I'm really happy with, although not everyone is happy, right? But we have spent the last 2 years in particular in developing our processes, committee charters, scoring tools, all of that. And then we put them on the CoC website, right, which is separate from my organization's website. We have a listserv, we use MailChimp, right, but there's a lot of tools out there, so it's all transparent. It doesn't mean everyone's still happy with it, but it's all available. We really have used our committees well. And then I think the other part about reallocation is really supporting applicants to do their best work, right, because this is important. All right, so the next, just going in a little bit, Cynthia mentioned, what are the tools that you use to understand your system? HMIS is really key. The point-in-time data, if you don't have great confidence in your HMIS, point-in-time, pulling the APRs. I have to say, though, like we do a little mini training every year, like what's a lever, what's a stayer, so I don't take it for granted that people know what's in their APRs. We are also, in addition to being the collaborative applicant, we're the HMIS lead. So we send our HMIS agencies monthly APRs so that they can be looking at it and correcting their data as they go. And then we do a big push during the NOFA because they haven't always done that. Cynthia mentioned the Continuum of Care spending plan template. That's a great way to really to change the conversation from just CoC dollars to homeless services dollars, right? So years ago, our continuum would talk about, HUD money like it was the only money going towards homelessness in our community. And, frankly, it's the single biggest funding source in our community, but it's not the only. And it's really when you take that, put all those different pieces together, that's when you can talk about, hey, look, this program is better funded by some other funding source. Good luck with that, maybe. Or or shouldn't be funded at all, or whatever, but it's having that holistic view. And so there's a couple of things there. If you can't do the more detailed spending plans, at least list, what's your CoC dollars? Do you have any state funds? Do you have any big private funders funding this issue, United Way, or for us, the Community Foundation is a big funder. So, but those are some tools, and so Cynthia mentioned they'll be on the website. So then the next slide, to just talk about planning and priority setting. So what you see on the right of that screen is a screenshot from our CoC website, and that's where, as we do our planning, we put it on the website, so that's all available. So those are not live links in this PowerPoint, but you can go to the website and find it. But I will say, so we're an older continuum. We've been a planning agency. We were created in the late 90s to do this function, but the HEARTH Act changed how we work completely. And so the governance actually makes things easier. It clarifies decision making, and it's also way more complicated. We can do a lot more scheduling and note taking, and it's a lot of work, so I'm not trying to say that it's not. But this is a little bit of our process. So the collaborative applicant staff, that's us. We develop a survey based on the data that we have and that picture of system funding. Right? So we know a lot about our system, and we put together a survey. We have a couple committees review that to get input on what should our regional funding priorities be. We did that this year in March, and we looked at funding for our HUD funding. How should we prioritize that? And including if we have new dollars to spend. And then we also used it for our state funding. So it was combined. We could do it once and really get, again, just reinforcing that these are connected pieces. So we had, the members of our CoC take that survey and then took that back to the board in the form of a memo, and the board approved those priorities, and then it all goes up on the website. And so, if you haven't done that yet, you could do a quick survey, just given the option, what should we look at, and you'll see we don't have the survey on our website, but looking at the 2015 funding priorities, then you could see what kind of questions we asked. So the next slide shows it's my attempt at a picture of our CoC governance. And I will say, it was so interesting to put this together because we do a lot we really did a lot of work to clarify decision making and further facilitating collaboration, but where we have more work to do, and some of y'all might be way ahead, is doing much more sort of straight up accountability focus. So I think that committee in yellow you'll see. But so let me just walk through. So the purple, that's Homeward, we're the nonprofit collaborative applicant and HMIS lead. So we staff the CoC, we do data and analysis, and then we do the coordinated funding processes. In red is our Continuum of Care membership. Oh, wait. Yeah, there we go. We have a Continuum of Care board with about 19 folks. It's chaired and co-chaired by 2 of our private funders, which is awesome. So if you all have a chance to do that, that's fantastic. We have our ranking, we call it our ranking committee. It's been around for a long time, but we've focused their work in the last couple of years. So they review and score application for both the state and federal funding. So they're neutral partners. I'll go a little bit more on that. Performance measurement, that's newer for us. I'll go through how they've been involved. And then we have other committees. We have a lot of committees. So they're not all on this screen, but again, our website has details. So the next slide, I tried to lay out specifically who does what in reallocation, right? Like, how do you have these hard conversations? So first, the Continuum of Care board. This may not seem like it's connected, but they approve our committee charters or job descriptions and elect members of those decision-making committees. So it really is about empowering members of our community to make these hard decisions and to really sort of take ownership of HUD monies and other monies and really say, like, this is our community purpose, is to end homelessness for our neighbors. And so that's very prosaic work, and it's a lot of wordsmithing, which we don't do in the board meeting, but that's an important factor that gets us to the point where we can then move money. The board approves the funding priorities. They approve the process for the funding that's proposed by the ranking committee, right? And we did that in March of this year, and there were a lot of TBDs, or to be determined. So our board approved it, like, these are the things that need to happen because we know the general order. And now we're going and plugging the dates. Our board reviews and approves the application and the submission. And this is a big one, they abide by the conflict of interest policy and enforce that as needed. We do have many funded agencies on our Continuum of Care board. It's about 1/3. And so we're really clear about what role they can play in these conversations, which is just one reason why, if you can get ahead of the funding cycle, it's easier. And then our board reports back to the CoC membership. So then into one of the key committees for reallocation is, we call it the ranking committee. There's lots of names for this, right? So it's the neutral partners. We have ESG staff, urban planners. We have funders, like I mentioned, formerly homeless individuals. And then it's linked. This is such an important committee for us. Our chair and vice chair sit on this committee. So they develop the process and timeline for the funding. They develop our scoring matrices, and I'll show you all a picture of that in just a second. They solicit the applications. They review the applications and project performance, using APRs, the budget, outcomes, all those things that Cynthia mentioned, although I'm going to double check my list. They score the applications using the scoring matrices, so we're comparing rapid rehousing to rapid rehousing. They reject or modify applications as needed. We've done that, with the dollars, trying to figure it out. We've taken away or added as needed. They provide information to the appeals committee. We have an appeal every funding process we do, so if y'all are in that situation, we have our appeals committee and process on our website. And then this would be the group that would strategize about the tiering to maximize funding. So I don't know exactly what that looks like for us yet, but as staff will really develop, okay, this is what HUD tells us, and then have that ranking committee really think that through. The other committees involved, so our performance measurement committee, again, this is not as fully functioning as we'd like, but these are our data folks. So we love data at Homeward, and there are lots of other people in the community who love data. So we have someone from our Fair Housing organization, a couple of the funders, performance evaluation staff, and then some of the providers who just love data. And they're job to date has been to review the system as a whole to sort of get that holistic understanding. They provide the input on our community surveys when we're soliciting feedback, and they provide input on the scoring matrices. And what's nice about that is it's a way to get a service provider voice without getting into conflict of interest issues. So they're reviewing it, but it's the ranking committee who's neutral who really moves it forward. We'd like to have more monitoring from this group and setting benchmarks, but not before November. And then finally, we do, I think one thing about reallocation is that people really think of it as their money. And so how do you shift that out? It really is by talking to a lot of people and, educating them and giving them an opportunity to provide input into that, right? So we have a coordinated entry committee. They reviewed the scoring matrix for the coordinated entry program type. Our service providers provide input through the surveys that we have. They receive their APRs for correction. We also pull together like program types. So over the summer, we had all of our renewal rapid rehousing providers come together to talk about gaps and our recovering priority populations. We're super excited about the opportunity to house single adults. That's our biggest population. We also brought together the permanent supportive housing providers to talk about how do we expand capacity. And then the last thing that service providers do is they do a phone presentation to our ranking committee. So they are involved in that process. Then next, so then this is what the staff does, right? So we draft all the documents for the board and committees. We look around at other communities, so thank you if something looks familiar to you. We analyze the data that we have from the surveys, from the system review. We complete, you'll see on our scoring matrices, we have things like this is a data point, we just pre-fill them in, right? Those are objective criteria. Because we are the HMIS lead, we help the grantees correct their data. And I don't know if anyone has this situation. We used to have grantees give us the APR, and now we say, no, we'll just pull it from HMIS. And that changed things pretty dramatically. It's really, put more emphasis on data quality. We have a part-time person on staff who provides technical assistance to grantees. Sometimes it's eSNAP's help or just talking through their products because we want them to do really good work. We coordinate all the different committees. We research other communities to see what's working. We put everything on the website, and then we schedule, which is a pain in the neck. All right. So this is just a little peek. This is our HMIS data form. So this is a picture, but it's from our website. You'll see the time period. It's HMIS. We do some custom reports to pull the data points we're interested in. So just to show, this part would be completed by staff, and the ranking committee would get that point. And then the next slide has a snapshot of our rapid rehousing scoring sheet. We started this, I think, 2 years ago with our state process and then have modified it each time. We do feedback survey for providers after the funding process and then tweak things. This is where our committees gave us a lot of input this year. And we, for instance, this year we redid the weighting of the points that we have. And so you'll see that we have, what's the scoring category, what are the points available. This snapshot just shows things that are, objective. We have others that don't just come from the data form. And then a description of what we mean. And this has already been given to our applicants, right? So in advance, before they write their application, they know what they'll be judged on. And that, when we were able to do this, that made a big difference, and we've been moving money, frankly, every year. And I thought we didn't need to move any money, but we're still looking at reallocation this year because we know we can do better. And then my last slide really is that, so this is a picture of our website. All this information is available to all the partners. And I think, when you're having these hard conversations about moving someone's money, right, because that's how people think of it, you really have to be clear about what are the criteria. And I think if nothing else, just showing like a summary of what the points are available. Like it's pretty clear how HUD wants this money to be used and how they expect us to use other monies, right, to serve the same purpose. That it does make, it takes some of the sting out of that someone, a service provider who views themselves as a helper, you know, being told, oh, you're not good enough. And you can really shift that to an objective conversation. It does make it easier. And then you can get, you know, more work done and help people get into housing. So my contact information is on the next slide, and I know that they'll, the National Alliance will post this. So thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Kelly. I am just so in awe of all the amazing work that you do, and I really appreciate in this super busy time you taking the time out to explain to all of us how you do your process and all the work that you've done. It's just immensely helpful. So we're going to answer a couple questions here, so please feel free to type your questions into the chat box. And Kelly has graciously agreed to stay on a couple minutes after 2 o'clock Eastern time to answer questions if need be, so please don't be shy, enter them in now. So I'll just start off with, we have a couple questions about transitional housing and reallocating transitional housing. So I'll throw this over to Cynthia first. Maybe you could share with us a couple different outcome measures, or what's really important to look at when you're evaluating your transitional housing in particular and in deciding whether or not to reallocate it. What types of things should people be looking at?
Okay, that's a great question. So it depends on, one, what kind of transitional housing project it is. So it makes kind of a difference if it is a project-based or a site-based transitional housing project, or if it's scattered site, because there's different considerations, right? When you have a project-based transitional housing project, what are you going to do with the building? How's that going to work? Oftentimes, there are projects that, let's say, want to actually, kind of change their criteria, their eligibility criteria, who they're serving, and they might want to take their transitional housing project and make it into a permanent supportive housing project or something like that. But the criteria that you would look at, first of all, a lot of the outcome criteria that we said you should look at for all programs. For transitional housing, the HUD standard is to look at whether that transitional housing project is exiting at least 80% of its participants to permanent housing. So at the end of the project, are they exiting to permanent housing? If they're falling below the national standard, one, that's going to hurt your CoC application, and two, it might, it's obviously showing that there's some performance issues there, and you can kind of figure out why. One thing to look at if you do see someone that may be performing a little bit lower in the outcomes is who are they serving. So if they're serving a really hard to serve population or highly vulnerable population, you might want to take that into consideration, that they might have slightly lower outcomes, right? We don't want to incentivize people to just serve kind of the quote unquote easier to serve, or folks that are going to be easier to house. I know that it's challenging to house most of the folks that you serve, but we don't want to incentivize basically creaming. So we want to make sure that we're taking that into account. But if it's a project that is a transitional housing project that is serving families, let's say, and they are maybe not meeting the 80% income, one thing to do is, you can give them takeaway points for that, depending on who they're serving. And then you can also compare the transitional housing project to other transitional housing projects in your community. So oftentimes it's helpful to take a look at all the transitional housing projects and look at what their costs are per client. So something to look at in cost effectiveness is just saying how much they spend on each participant. And it's often helpful, I want to say, and I meant to say this earlier, to not just look at their HUD budgets. You can ask in your local application for them to give you their entire program budget. They're probably going to have other funding sources. It'll give you a better picture of how the funding is working and how it relates to those outcomes. So just getting the HUD project funding sometimes it doesn't give you a whole picture. So if you can get more, you should ask for more. But even with just the HUD budget, you can see, okay, well, they're spending X amount per client based on, on their budget. Let's look at another. Let's say they're spending $10,000 per client. You can look at another transitional housing project, and you want to look at one that serves a similar population, and they're serving, they're spending $60,000 per client per exit. So why is that? Is one serving a harder population? Is one, one doesn't seem. It's such a big difference. So why is one spending more? Is it a cost-effectiveness issue? And another thing to look at is if you have transitional housing projects that have high barriers. So one of the things that we've talked about a bunch of times now is that housing first approach. The NOFA is scoring and asking a lot of questions about whether these projects are low barrier, and that's including transitional housing. So if you have transitional housing that has a lot of income barriers, sobriety requirements, a lot of mandatory participation requirements, kind of a lot of things you have to do while you're there, those are not housing first approaches, and you won't be able to get points for those projects. And so when they are scored, that's going to be a challenge to get full points for those projects in your application. That hurts your overall CoC score on that project. So one thing to do is to look at that, give them an opportunity if they want to change those eligibility criteria, or to think about reallocating some of those funds. And another thing you can look at probably is just the need. Do you need the transitional housing project? Or can you serve that same group of people with a rapid rehousing project, which often has the same income, the same outcomes, and serves more families? So things like that. Those are the different types of things I would think to look at.
And this is Kelly. The only thing I would add is that when we had those conversations a few years ago, every transitional housing provider said, "Oh, but we serve high-need clients." Like, well, you can't all serve
right.
So it's really using your data from the APRs to get at that.
That's a great point, Kelly. What kind of data, Kelly, do you look at to sort of see who's serving high-need folks?
So we look at those who are serving the number of people who are homeless for the first time, which is an imperfect measure, right? Because domestic violence victims wouldn't be included. If they're serving anyone who's chronically homeless, and then we look at the barriers on the APR. How many barriers do the clients have? So it's a combination. It ends up being a combination of factors, and then having the conversations with them, and they can share notes. And that makes a difference.
Yeah, that's great.
So I have a quick question for you, Kelly, and then maybe a more complicated question. So one of our attendees has noticed that your CoC chair and vice chair are part of the ranking committee. Are either of those folks homeless service providers?
No, they're both funders.
And the more complicated question, we have a community who fully recognizes the importance of rapid rehousing, but doesn't have any rapid rehousing providers in their community now. So how would you encourage providers in that kind of scenario to transition to rapid rehousing when there isn't a lot of experience with that in the community? So I'll let Kelly answer that first, and then see if Cynthia has anything to add.
So I think one thing to remember is that, we're making funding decisions now, but the money won't come to your community until next year. Now, I don't know if this would be funded, right, but you got to start somewhere. And so it's really about what you can, rapid rehousing has been so effective in our community. So, whenever you start it, you just need to start. You have to do it. And you need training and support, and there are lots of resources available. There's people you can talk to. There's the National Alliance conferences, which are really helpful. But and again, I don't know if the timing would work, but having a provider who's willing to try it again and do it in a way that would score high enough to be funded. But at a certain point, you just got to do it. That's my.
And I want to put a plug in for Kelly. For Richmond too, that you have done a lot of reallocation to rapid rehousing over the past few years and seen incredible outcomes in your community, even when giving it to newer providers, right?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean, it is it's cheaper, and we're getting the same or better outcomes. And when initially staff were worried that they wouldn't be able to provide good services, they find that they can do better services when people are in housing. And so it's really gratifying on that level for the staff who are doing that really hard work with the households.
That's great. So I'll ask one more question. I don't see a ton of other questions, so if you still have a question, we still have some time, so please don't be shy. So this is a question about match being a little more challenging with rapid rehousing programs rather than transition in place programs. So I'm wondering, Kelly, if you have any words of wisdom about finding ways to match with a rapid rehousing program.
Right, no, match is really hard, and it was a factor with some programs not wanting to change their programs to be what's really effective. So there's two pieces. One, I mean, if you don't change, you'll lose your money, right? I mean, just like you won't get the points, it's competitive, right? So that's something to keep in mind. But it's also, we very consciously have funders involved in our, sort of embedded in our continuum of care, because they need to know that there are needs that these big federal dollars cannot meet, and it's really through their involvement and deep understanding of like, hey, we can't fund this program, but we need it, that they can sometimes help step that up with grants or something else. So again, that's not necessarily a quick fix, but it's also just committing as part of these hard conversations to saying, okay, well, what is the barrier? Is it the match? Is it staff or lack of training? And then being able to tackle what the real issue is. They're not what we think it might be, or why people are hesitant to reallocate.
Anything to add, Cynthia?
No, I think that Kelly covered it really, really well.
Great. So I don't see any new questions other than some folks asking if this is being recorded. This will be posted on our website hopefully today or on Monday at the latest, www.endhomelessness.org. So thank you so much, and I'll turn it over to Cynthia to wrap up the webinar.
Thank you. Again, thank you, Kelly, for your fabulous wisdom and sharing the experience that you're having in Richmond. It's incredibly helpful to see how that works on the ground. And Anna, thank you for helping us with this webinar. I think that the thing I want to leave folks with is this is an overwhelming time. You have a million things to do and a ton of meetings to schedule. And I know that this can seem like a big process, but you can take the simple steps. You can put together a scoring tool. You can get that approved quickly. You don't need a scoring tool if projects want to voluntarily reallocate. They really need, I encourage you to make sure that the project applicants understand that there's very little room in that tier 2 process, in how they're going to be able to score points in that. So that there are things you can do right away. You can take some of these tools and just adopt them and always tweak them in the future. And as Kelly put so wisely, you have to start somewhere. And you definitely still have the time to be able to implement this and get the kind of full points you're going to need to be competitive in the NOFA application. So I wish you the best of luck. I definitely am grateful for all the work that you do. I know it's really hard, and we are here if you have questions.